right. Good morning, everybody. The subject of our talk is optimization of the quality system for software as a medical device. But before we get started, I just wanted to say a little bit about me and the company that I work for. My name is Seyed Khorashahi, and I head the medical device portion of our consulting business. And regulatory compliance does regulatory affairs, everything from pre-submission to submissions and post-submissions for all life sciences, not only medical devices, but also pharma, combo devices, etc. We also do help companies when they do get any sort of regulatory enforcements, like 483s or warning letters or consent decree. We help with the response to those. We also work proactively, ensuring quality assurance, building up quality system, putting in improvements. In case that there's a need for remediation of quality system, design history file, etc., we can help in that area. And also if you need regulatory strategy in terms of which is the best pathway, that's what we do. Enough about us. So today on the agenda is we'll talk about what is software as a medical device, how is it different than other medical devices, and when you're trying to optimize, what are the key elements that you just have to keep in mind to design your system but still have an effective quality system. We'll talk about the IMDRF, the International Medical Device Regulator Forum's SaMD QMS framework. And we'll then cover some of the key takeaways and leave some time at the end for comments and questions. So first, there are like 4 guidance documents that came from IMDRF between 2013 to 2017 that are key documents in terms of interpreting what this means, that FDA was also a part of. So those are key definitions: risk categorization, quality system, which we'll touch on this presentation, and then clinical evaluation, how to go about doing that. Also, obviously, anytime you do software, IEC 62304 is the key guidance documents that is used for that. And in case you're doing any sort of Agile development, it's all about the TIR 45 that allows you to do that for medical devices. And obviously, if you're doing any sort of AI/ML, then you better have your good machine learning practices in place. And there's definitely the guiding principles that FDA, Health Canada, and MHRA came out with. Not long ago, back 2-3 years ago, FDA came out with this guidance document on policy of device software functions. And in that, they basically categorize these types of software in 3 categories. If it meets the definition of a device, then it's one thing. If it doesn't meet it, you just have to determine that up front. So if it doesn't meet the definition of a medical device, that it doesn't treat, cure, mitigate, or diagnose diseases, then it's not a medical device, and then FDA does not regulate those devices. And these devices could be things that are used in the healthcare environment, but really they don't have any impact on your accounting system, for example, your appointment systems. And FDA, by the way, in this guidance document does have 3 separate appendices that cover what are the examples of each of these categories. Then the middle category is about, you do fit the medical device definition, but it's low risk and, let's just say smoking cessation, software that motivates people to stop smoking, although it's health related and it fits the definition, but FDA basically does enforcement discretion, and it's a risk that the manufacturers basically take and say, well, FDA is not going to be actually applying oversight for those. And then the third category is the actual medical devices that we'll cover in this presentation and we'll talk about more. But it's very important for the classification and knowing where you fall in these three buckets. So what do SaMDs do anyways? I mean, this is a generic pattern for SaMDs. It usually takes in some input that are either patient data, lab results, images that are coming in from, CT scan, x-rays, etc. It takes in, maybe you get some information from the patients by having a questionnaire with their symptoms, or it uses clinical guidelines that have been done by the clinicians. It takes that information and it applies some type of algorithm to transform that into something that is going to be useful, that either treats, diagnoses, it drives clinical management, or it informs the clinicians to make those sorts of decisions. That's basically all of the software as medical devices would do. And how are these software as medical devices different than medical devices that may have software or may not have software in them? Usually the software medical devices have a lot quicker development cycle, especially if you're using Agile methodologies, and then you're planning to release some portion of it that is that has enough functionality. And when you have software medical devices, the changes could be frequent, and hence you have to have more rigor involved, because not only that, but also you have the ability to mass deploy them depending on what your deployment mechanism is. In the good old days when you had hardware, you had to go in and install it. That basically helped you to get some feedback how the device is running compared to when you could push a lot of these out, and it definitely presents its own problems, and that hence having a quality system that is optimized for it. Also, software as a medical device typically uses these off-the-shelf or soup item software of unknown provenance in the IEC 62304 terminology that help you do the rest of the stuff, whether it's the operating system you use, whether it's your databases, whether it's your communication stack, or whatever sort of a thing that you need. You could just buy it off the shelf and incorporate it. But none of those things were designed for medical devices, so there are steps and things that you have to do to make sure that in terms of safety and efficacy, they do what you need to do. Then another thing, as we talked about, typically software as medical devices take input from something. If I'm getting like my images from, PAC systems that are coming in, then there's an interface right there for the input to come in. I do my algorithms, whether they're AI or any other algorithms that I apply, and then convert it to something else. That something else, the output, might also go to another system. So there's interoperability. So when we're talking about the rapid mass deployment, you got to keep track of, I got to interface with this other medical device, I got to interface with this other medical device. That itself might be a hardware medical device, or it might be another SaMD, and then what are the versions of those? Am I compatible? Am I working? So those are the things that you definitely need to keep track of. And also, since SaMDs run on platforms, computing platforms that are supplied by the end users, and they might vary in terms of who the manufacturer of those hardwares are, what the versions of the hardwares are, what software are running on those. Those computers may be running other software, so it's a lot of those things that you have, that brings in challenges. And also when you're trying to do you're testing what are those permutations of the configurations and the different levels of things. Because when you have your software, whether it runs on mobile devices or runs on desktops or servers, you got to keep track of all of those. And one of the bigger problems or challenges that we have to keep in mind is the fact that software can be copied and distributed, and then sometimes it's outside of the control of the manufacturer. And with that, it creates really problems, because the whole idea is that you keep track of who you sold your software to, who is using it, in case if there's a recall, you can go back and inform them what to do and then how you're going to address it. And it presents those sorts of challenges for us. So to deal with all of these, IMDRF has a risk categorization that is two-dimensional, basically. What does your software, what problem is it trying to solve? And what is the risk factor of that problem or that health situation pre-mitigation? Is it critical that might result in death, etc.? Is it serious that it might be permanent injury? Or is it something that doesn't require any sort of action from that perspective? And then it really depends. So obviously critical being the highest risk, and if you're treating or diagnosing and it's a critical, which means pre-mitigation, it could lead to death, then it's a Cat 4, which is the highest level of risk. On the other hand, the whole concept of driving clinical is when your software basically is used to immediately make those decisions, and then people get used to that concept of relying on the software to make the decision. Informing, you basically provide information and everything else behind it, and the clinician looks at it, and then they may or may not go with what basically the information that you have provided. So it's a just lower level of risk from that perspective. So with that in mind, I think this is an important piece of the puzzle that you have to figure out at the beginning. And as I said, you want to look at it pre-mitigation in terms of what the risk factors are if your software were to fail, or the condition that you're trying to actually address. So what are some of the QMS optimization principles that we should keep in mind when we are trying to optimize? Optimizing basically is a streamlining, and when we're trying to streamline, we just got to remember what are the key factors that we got to keep in mind. And software, because it's, development cycles are quicker, because we could do mass deployment, etc., we have to have more control, or we have to have a better way. That's why when you look at the regulators, there are a lot more standards about how to do software, like the IEC 62304, the TIR 45, etc., on the software side as opposed to the hardware side, because it's much easier to make changes and then go out in the field. And we just have to keep in mind that there's two major things that we do for any sort of medical devices. It's one is to ensure that it is effective. It does perform as expected, which means that we have the quality system in place to make sure that our process is effective. And with having a process effective, we have a better chance of making sure that not only we specify properly the user needs, but also that we have, through verification and validation and other objective evidence, that we can demonstrate that we have the functionality that is reliable and does ensure that we have an effective software that performs as expected. The other aspect of it is safety. Again, we just need to make sure that we have our risk management processes in place that are adequate and helps us basically identify all of the hazards, and then make sure that we have mitigated them and our software is free from any unacceptable risk. It doesn't mean that we have effectively eliminated all the risks, but we have this whole concept of risk benefit where we're able to say that we basically have used the state of the art and sufficiently mitigated it to be able to say that our benefits outweigh our risks. Obviously, when we're designing quality system, one size does not fit all. It really depends on the risk of your products, what it does, etc. And then we want to keep that in mind. We want to take a risk-based approach. We want to do critical thinking, and it's not about a checklist that we check, and then we say we're done, because we just have to remember, it's not just about compliance, it's about public health, and that's what FDA and other regulatory bodies are out there to just protect public health. So let's just jump into the quality system management that IMDRF has come up and specialized. So what they did was basically took the ISO 13485 and then kept in mind what do you have to do in software, and then they have linkages back to ISO 13485, but it's more specialized for software as a medical device. And they have it in 3 rings basically. The first ring is organizational support, and we'll talk a little bit about it, but the bottom line is that that's no different than what we have. The middle ring is about managing your software as a medical device lifecycle processes that are also similar, but where the differences come in, it's just that in the core, which are the activities that you have to do for your lifecycle management, which we'll discuss a little bit more. Leadership, this should not be any surprise for anybody that has done ISO 13485 or is compliant with 820, and this is all about management responsibility, customer support. It's about management review, making sure that your quality system is healthy, and then you look at the totality of your system. It's about making sure that you have all the proper resources to have an effective quality system, which means they have the right skill set, that you have provided training, and then you have the infrastructure and environment to ensure that effective quality system. So this would not be any different than any organization that has a ISO 13485 quality system that wasn't designed for software or the 820 quality system. So managing SaMD, so this is like when you are doing product planning for your design and development. It's about patient risk, documentation, and software configuration, and then how do you do continuous improvements, and then software. Since you could parcel out pieces, then there's an opportunity for outsourcing, and you need to have processes in place to deal with that outsourcing piece. So here's a lifecycle activities with 62304. Obviously 62304 does not include some of the stuff up front in terms of user needs and user requirements, and it does not include validation, but it includes everything in the product development, from planning your software all the way to releasing your software. So it's planning, requirements analysis, your high-level, low-level design, your architecture and detailed design, and then your verification, and then your software release. And then throughout that process, you basically have these other processes. So that's your development process, but throughout that development process, you are also doing your risk management, which we'll talk a little bit about, because risk management for software is a little bit different. You do your configuration management, and you do your problem resolution. Any times in software, if there are more than one person doing the work, we're used to configuration management tools, version management, and all of that, so that should not be an issue. But it's all about problem resolution, that as we find issues and problems, that we have it recorded properly, we investigate it, we address it, and that's throughout the whole life cycle. Now, when we look at this, it looks like it's a waterfallish sort of a model that it uses, but 62304 does not dictate which way you go, and then they allow you to do it in any way, shape, or form you want to do, and people use different aspects of how to do this, and obviously one of those is the Agile methodology, and in Agile, basically the idea is that you want to move fast, but for medical devices, you just want to have some level of control in place. So as you look at what you have to do if you're doing user stories, and then you're going by user stories, for example, and you pick up your sprints, how many basically of those user stories you want to do. Some of these user stories might be just brand new stories, some of them might be modification to existing ones. It's about putting the sprints together, and then you have to figure out at what point in time you want to harden all your documentation, because Agile is all about moving fast. But in medical devices, you need to have your documentation, basically your design and development documentation, DHF, and that's your requirements documentation, your architecture and detailed design documentation, and your VMV documentation and traceability across those. And then that's why in this model, for example, you could choose that you may do a few sprints and then you release to the client. Maybe the worst case scenario should be that you harden all your documentation before it goes out the door, that you have everything in place before you do that. So that's just a mechanism if you're using Agile development. Just have to keep in mind, even though you may not do all of your documentation the way that is expected by FDA and other regulatory bodies, but you really have to catch up to it before, at some point in time. And as I said, the latest it would be before it goes out the door to be used out in the field, that it has to be updated. So I talked a little bit about risk model, and then software risk management is a little bit different than hardware risk management, because software issues and problems are systemic problems, and because they're systemic problems, typically frequency of occurrence is assumed to be 100%. I've seen it too much where people have frequency of occurrence and they're using it incorrectly just because they transferred the stuff from hardware to software. But I think with this picture, basically, the way we have it, we have occurrence in three different pieces. One is what's the likely occurrence of that failure pre-mitigation. And that has a frequency of occurrence associated with it, because we haven't gotten to the software. Then there's the probability of occurrence once we put our software mitigations in place. And this is all about software causes, right? So that is always 100%. And then once we basically ship our product out the door, then the end users, they also mitigate issues to prevent a hazardous situation leading to a harm. That's completely outside of our system, but that's why you get clinicians involved to help you with the overall probability of occurrence of harm. When we talk about the severity, we're talking about severity of harm. We're not talking about the severity of the hazardous situation, but we're talking about, did it result in a harm? Well, for it to result in a harm, you got a probability, what's the chances of this happening, which depends on what basically problem you're trying to solve or what health situation you're addressing, and then what does your software do basically, and then the rest of the stuff. So if I have, for example, a diagnostics piece of SaMD, it's all about my false positives and false negatives and what happens if I do those things, and then what do the clinician do? For example, if I have a hematology instrument, which is something that I worked on, if I look at my hemoglobin and it's wrong, and it's 8, for example, and I look at my RBC that is 5, the clinician would never do a transfusion because they know 3 times RBC is plus minus 20% of HGB. And clinically, even though the result is wrong, but it's not going to result in any harm to the patient, because the clinician will never do that, because the outside, basically, clinician prevented that harm from happening, although the guideline says if you have a hemoglobin of 8, I need to transfuse you with blood. So that's where that other aspect comes in, and the harm is all the way through the harm, that takes all those steps. But that occurrence of post is always 100%, and that's something that people don't typically look at, but both FDA, IEC 62304, ISO 13485, they have a definition for systemic failures, and then define it as such that the frequency of occurrence is 100%, and you're supposed to rely on the harm or the severity of harm. So if you happen to have basically algorithms that took your input and converted it to something that is of clinical significance and used a AIML, then you got to keep in mind, how do you select your data, what you allocate your training, what do you do for your validation, how do you go about, at the beginning of that this is how I'm going to do my algorithm changes. When the algorithm changes come along, how do you retrain them? How do you evaluate that they do what it needs to be done? And then how do you want to change it out in the field? Obviously, locked algorithms are the way that almost most people go, and they're not. At this stage, I don't think we have enough of algorithms that learn on the fly, because that requires a lot more controls in terms of monitoring the actual stuff that is going on out in the field. But there are a lot more locked algorithms that FDA has already cleared. So with verification, basically this is all about, I define my requirements. I did, IC 62304 basically looks at three things. It's unit verification, integration, and then system software testing against your requirements. So you do all of those. IC 62304 does not talk about validation. That happens at the system level. So all your usability testing, for example, IC 62366, your clinical stuff, all of that is outside of the scope of IC 62304. But the IMDRF came up with these buckets of how do you go about clinical evaluation. So the first bucket is all about you doing clinical evaluation, doing literature search, comparing it to other devices that does the same sort of stuff, and figuring out basically what you need to do, and then how establishes your software as a medical device. Then analytical validation is about your VMV that you do on it's design verification and validation and the things that you do. And then the clinical validation, depending on how your literature search, depending on the risk of your device, what category it is, etc. This is where you determine whether you need to do investigations, and then how do you check and ensure the performance and the safety of your device. That would be through these studies. So now we have a software that we have gone through the whole, all the activities. We have verified and validated it. Now it's about the deployment. And as I said before, in software, depending on how we do this, if it is basically deployment through the internet and we have connection to the devices, etc., we got to be careful in a sense that there's cybersecurity. There's all these other elements that we have to be careful with, which typically, if I had a hardware device, I have, my production becomes a big part of what I do. In software, production is just fairly simple what you do and how you reproduce basically a software that you have tested and verified. And distribution is much, much easier, as opposed to going out in the field and installing these things. You're installing it on the fly. But I think one of the key elements is that if you can have somebody on the other side to basically accept when you're trying to update their software, for example, it helps mitigate a lot of things in terms of cybersecurity, because now you have a physical presence and it's just your software, it doesn't get updated that way. So those are the little bit differences in terms of when you're dealing with software as opposed to hardware medical devices, and you just have to keep in mind. So IC 62304 does have a process that is the maintenance process. Basically, it uses the other four processes: product development, configuration management, problem resolution, and risk management, to go through the whole concepts. And it's about establishing a maintenance plan, having a listening system that listen to what the clients are telling us, the end users, and then being able to investigate it. If it is something that needs to be reported to regulatories, then it's a reportable event, and then it has to be properly dealt with. We got to have some sort of a short-term mitigation, what to do or how to avoid it, and also have something that we go about, and depending on the risk and what we know what the harm is, to update and re-release the software to address the issue so that we minimize its impact. All good things will need to come to an end at some point in time, and then over the years, whether you are having another product that replaces that or you're getting out of the market after many years, you just have to keep in mind that there is a process to basically retire your product. You gotta inform the end users when you're not selling anymore, at what point in time you're not servicing it anymore, so that they have an opportunity. If you have another, obviously, replacement for it, then they can move over. If there's any data that needs to be transferred, or if there's data that needs to be preserved, that you have opportunity to do those. And then from that perspective, you take into account all of the things for making sure that in terms of data integrity, security, all of those things are in place for your decommissioning. So with all of that, I think this is my last slide, and it's all about, we have these documents from IMDRF on software as a medical device, and then we could definitely use that as something that interprets what it impacts has on medical devices. Classification of medical devices, not only is it a medical device, is it not a medical device? If it's a medical device, then what category is it, etc., is the key, because you really do need to use how much rigor you put into your quality system controls based on the risk level that you determine what your product is going to have. And as I said before, it's about pre-mitigation risk. It's not about once you mitigated it, what the risk of the device is. And then it's all about, okay, now I put the product out in the marketplace, how do I monitor it? Like if you guys are using DevOps development methodology, it's your ops that is just keeping track of things that are coming in, making sure that, from the cybersecurity, from clinical performance, you're okay. And typically with software, since it works with other stuff, well, remember, like we talked about, we take some inputs. Some of these inputs might come, for example, from an EHR. And EHR, most of them are not considered to be medical devices unless they have some features that they have made it into a medical device. So you're working with this non-medical device, you're interfacing to it, you're getting information, etc. And then you just have to make sure that in terms of when they make a new release that you're aware of, it doesn't break your system. When you're making a new release, it doesn't break the system that the client has, that has this ecosystem that has multiple pieces of software in place. And then in terms of validation, it's, again, all about the risk categorization. We talked about the clinical validation, but it goes with the usability, IC 62366, and it goes with, how connected you are, for example, with your cybersecurity risk assessment, which you want to take all of those under your risk management, whether I'm doing a cybersecurity threat modeling, whether I'm doing a usability, basically failure mode and effect analysis or an application FMEA, or I'm doing it based on my design. I want to take all of those things that impact my performance or impact my safety, and I want to just bring all of those to my hazards analysis and make sure that I have mitigations for them and I take care of them. And just keep in mind that one size does not fit all, and we can have different ways depending on what the risk is. With that, I think we're going to go to questions and answers.